Hi, my name is Jonathan Raditz, and welcome back to the Rema Report after yet another long hiatus. Life is pretty busy in my part of the world trying to get various things done. So, videos have been hard to come by in the last many months. I think the last one I put up was in the summer. That being said, I was asked by somebody close to my family to do a protracted study on the book of Revelation. I mean, after all, when I was in university and I got my theology degree, that was my text of expertise, if so to speak. Now, even if I absolutely despise the term experts say in corporate media, whenever I see that, I can be pretty sure that whatever expert is being referred to, if I'm even dealing with a real human being on the other end of that statement, is emphatically more often than not an expert in what's being stated. So my credentials, as they were, are, what makes me an expert in the book of Revelation? Well, I don't know. I spent a lot of time studying it. I've spent a fair amount of time translating big chunks of it from the Greek, and I spent some time with John's text. That being said, I think probably the very first thing that I would want to say about the book of Revelation and apocalyptic literature generally would be that there's a lot of room for humility from the onset. It would be much better for you to acknowledge what you don't know about the text than assert what you think you know. I say this because I've been studying this text for more than 10 years, and I still find it to be remarkably opaque, meaning it's a very, very challenging text to interpret in any kind of coherent fashion. Some people will disagree with me and they say it's perfectly clear, and then go on to recite, some other guy's model of interpretation. So the first thing I would want to do here today is actually spend a little bit of time talking about what we know, what we don't know, and some interpretive challenges that you're going to come across with the book of Revelation. So the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, how do you read this book literally? Protestants, evangelical Christians in particular, really like to place an emphasis on the importance of reading a text literally. But that in and of itself is very, very challenging in terms of many biblical literary genres. A poem or a metaphor finds its literal meaning in the metaphor. And it's not the same thing as, for instance, a text like Deuteronomy, which is a legal document. Nor is that the same thing as a historiography, like 1st and 2nd Kings. So, different books in the Bible tell their story from a different literary place. The Gospels are sort of biographies of Jesus Christ, but even embedded within that, you're going to find the parable literary genre, which is sort of, in some ways, has many things in common with apocalyptic literature, because they're living metaphors, which is why you can apply parables to many different circumstances in your Christian life. But at the same time, there is a coherent meaning to these parables. I cannot make them mean things that they clearly don't. So there's that. Similarly, if you look at Paul's epistles, you're going to find a series of letters. But embedded in these letters, you're going to find some prophetic utterances. You're going to find some rather dense theological treatises, dogmatic statements, almost like catechistic, that function as a catechism, a teaching platform, which is what Paul is doing in so many of his epistles. Other times they're just going to be addressing direct issues that have a historical reference point. So there are, in virtually every single biblical text, layers of meaning. So that's one thing. But then you get into probably the two most challenging types of literature in the Bible are the prophetic corpus in the Old Testament and this apocalyptic text, bookmarking the end of the Bible at the end of the New Testament, John's Apocalypse, which is so reliant and leaning very heavily on the prophetic books of the Old Testament. So John is definitely interacting with that material very much so. He quotes them quite a bit indirectly, or in certain ways that would kind of bring new meaning to both texts, the text in the Old Testament and the text that he's writing, John's Apocalypse, right? So then after that, when you get into the text in and of itself, you're going to come across some really big challenges in terms of, well, what kind of literature is it? The book describes itself as a book of prophecy, on the one hand, a unveiling of all of history, and also it's got some epistles, some letters written into it, and it's metaphorical visionary literature, but at the same time, all of that is based on a what appears to be a fully legitimate experience. I was in the Spirit. This is actually the topic of my thesis in university. What does John mean in the Greek when he says "en egenemo en pneumati"? I was in the Spirit. What does he mean by that? And so I wrote like 150 pages explaining what I felt he meant by that, and some interpretive issues that come along with that. And I felt that was important because it kind of, that's the framework. John had I'll use a modern term, an out-of-body experience, and that's exactly what he describes. And I'm not trying to sound like New Age flake at all. He had an out-of-body experience. His spirit left his body, went through some sort of portal. You read about that in Revelation 4. And then he experienced a series of visions that are not necessarily chronological in order. Although there appears to be some sort of progression as the book moves forward. There is a sort of a progression to it. It's not a strictly chronological beginning, middle, end kind of a structure. It's more like cinema, where the action moves back and forth quite freely in space and time. It's a very common device in cinema. Prior to going back to university as a theology student, I worked extensively in video and cinema. I was a director and a line producer and an editor, so I can lean on my experience in that area as well, saying, yes, you can move the action back and forth in time and put emphasis on specific things as you see fit to move forward a narrative that is, in broader terms, moving forward. So, John's chronology in the book of Revelation is really, really tricky. It moves back and forth in time, and it's not always easy to locate yourself at any given point. That being said, there seems to be recurrent events that are re-experienced with slightly different perspectives while articulating a sort of progression of events. You would be able to definitely say that. That being said, there are a whole bunch of tangents, that is to say, breakaway visions, that are not strictly speaking part of that chronological progression of the narrative of that book. So there's that. So on the one hand, to give you an example specifically about what I'm talking about, you'll have the breaking of the seals, and there are 6 that are broken on an earthly plane, and 1 that seems to take us back to another dimension, a heavenly realm. Then after that, you have if memory serves me correctly, you move straight into the trumpet sequence, and there are 7, right? And then after that, finally, the bowls of wrath. But there's a lot of other visions that break that action up and are not necessarily progressive in terms of the narrative. So John breaks away from that. We would call that recapitulation. While at this, so there are 2 basic ways of looking at it. Is he recapitulating the same theme over 3 different ways, or is he describing a progressive sort of series of events? There are 2 schools of thoughts on that, but the one thing that becomes clear when you look at Revelation is that it's actually more fruitful to look for a plenitude of meaning instead of trying to pinpoint things to one specific thing. Which brings me to a really important point. Which way you want to interpret Revelations, you're going to have to contend with the fact that it's a symbolic text. Now, this word, very loaded word, symbolic text, symbolism, symbolic language, what does that mean? It's very tricky, because a symbol points to something beyond itself, which basically means you cannot read a symbolic text in a literal way, because it defies the purpose of a symbol. A symbol is always wanting to point to something beyond itself, right? And so when I tell you that every single aspect of John's text is anchored in the symbolic significance of every single motif, you have a very, very dense text that needs to be unpacked vertically. And I'm going to have, I would like to spend most of this video here right now explaining what symbolic language is. And if we can understand that in a pragmatic way, then we are well on our way to understanding this text better. And even so, we're going to be presented with big challenges about what exactly this means. I will say that if you yield this exegetical perspective responsibly, the text is surprisingly specific in its symbolic values. And you're able to tease out a surprisingly specific cluster of meaning at any given time. But it's really dense, and it's very challenging, and it requires a fair amount of patience. And as I mentioned at the beginning, also a fair amount of humility, because it would be much better to actually approach such a text in an open-ended way rather than a closed-ended way. So it's not good to walk into John's revelation thinking you know what this means. It's better to allow the text to explain to you what it means. So in academic terms, we would call that you need to accept the text on its own merits, you have to take the text at face value. And the tendency within the Protestant exegetical tradition is to actually go ahead and impose your prescribed notion of what this means and then say that's what you're doing, that you're actually taking John at face value. But taking John at face value means taking John at face value. And so that means that you need to try to put yourself in the mind of a disciple of Jesus Christ who experienced Jesus as a man, the resurrection, and the birth of the Christian church. You would have to remember that he's Jewish, and so his symbolic values that he uses are steeped in the Old Testament. He quotes the prophets quite extensively, as well as the book of Psalms. And that you would then have to try to understand the mindset of an ancient Hebrew in late antiquity. And you would also have to try to understand the mindset of the pagan audience reading, even if they were newly converted to Christianity. You would have to understand that everybody involved with that text would be engaging what we will call the motifs, and that means every little aspect of the text, really. So everybody understood the number 7 in a certain way. Certainly the Hebrews understood it in a certain way. Everybody understood terms like east, west, north, and south in a certain way, and would understand that there was a certain symbolic value to those texts. Everybody would understand trumpet in a certain way, scales in a certain way, horses in a certain way, and all of these things would have symbolic value. The modern mind would just want to say a horse is a horse, and so you would be tempted to think that in John's text that we should at one point expect horses to come gallivanting through the sky, and I know a pastor who really does believe that this is what's going to happen. And no, that's not what's going on in this text. You know, in the ancient world, everybody would understand that the horse is a psychopomp, which has the ability to cross over one dimension to another, from the land of the living to the land of the dead, as the case may be. So it's a psychopomp kind of animal. So that's its symbolic value. So when we read, for instance, the 4 horses of the apocalypse, we're dealing with an animal that has the ability to transport something from one place, one dimension, right? The spiritual dimension, as you will, or the infernal, as the case is, because these are, in fact, negatively activated symbols in the 4 riders of the apocalypse, cross over onto the terrestrial plane. So that's how you would actually understand that. That's how everybody reading that text in antiquity would understand that. So your task, your job in the 21st century is to try to reverse engineer how everybody in circa 90 would understand the value of all of these motifs. Right? So the problem with the Christian exegetical approach as of post-Enlightenment is that we forget the archetypal value of these things that everybody else seems to understand, the audience and the writer. And we also have our own new system of denominationalism and all those other things that kind of plug new meaning that was not at all present in antiquity. So recovering all of that and reverse engineering all that is a monumental task in and of itself. Huge job. So a really good way to understand symbols is, and I have that right here, I'll read it to you. It's an anthropological definition. And when I was writing my thesis, I was quoting an anthropologist named Mary Womack. And she provides an excellent definition of what symbolic language is. And I'm going to read it, and I'm going to sort of bullet point it so that we can really keep this firmly in mind. I'm going to refer to this over and over and over again, basically to remind us, to give us some sort of an exegetical contour, like a tool, a key, to be able to understand what we mean when we say we have to actually figure out the symbolic value of any given motif at any given time. So, most anthropologists distinguish symbols from signs. Both symbols and signs communicate through images, words, and behaviors. Signs, however, have only one possible meaning, whereas symbols, by definition, convey multiple levels of meaning at the same time. This is very important. I'm going to repeat that. Symbols, by definition, convey multiple levels of meaning at the same time. That is, symbols are multivocal. They speak with multiple voices. Polysemic. They have multiple levels of meaning. And finally, they are multivalent. They make more than one appeal. Right? Fair enough. So, let's take a symbol, a really easy one, like bread. Bread in the Bible means a lot of different things. It means the thing you eat to make sure that you have sustenance to be able to carry on living. So it's a sort of a something you put into yourself to nourish yourself to live. That is the literal understanding of bread. But bread also means spiritual nourishment, right? Bread of life. I am the bread of life. So Jesus actually takes a common symbol, bread, and actually applies a spiritual dimension to that symbol and brings it back to himself. So if you say bread, if you, as a good Protestant exegete, want to take everything in the Bible literally, when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, then you would have to imagine him as a walking croissant or a baguette or a piece of toast or naan bread, because that would be the literal understanding of that word. But of course, we all understand that that's not at all what it means in Jesus's usage. What he's saying is he is the ultimate source of not just your physical well-being, but your spiritual well-being, your salvation, the bread of life, right? Then after that, that symbol then takes on an additional meaning when you realize that the body that has to be sacrificed in order for you to be able to partake of the bread of life then comes in. Then we bring in communion. And so you have this whole cluster of meanings that actually point to salvation. And so bread is not just bread, and it never was just bread. Same even in the Old Testament. Manna points to Jesus as the bread of life, right? So that's why in Revelation, he actually refers back to manna and makes sure that we understand that it's all oriented and directed back to him. That's just one very simple little excursus to illustrate the fact that a symbol means more than one thing at the same time. And it makes more than one appeal at the same time. When Jesus is saying he is the bread of life, he is appealing both to your sustenance, as he is the author of your life in the flesh, even in this fallen state. He is the author of creation, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And it's in John, of course, that we do read that Jesus is the bread of life, right? So that's Gospel of John, same author that's bringing us over into Revelation. And now he's experiencing visions where everything that he sees is loaded with a meaning that points beyond itself. So when he sees, for instance, 4 riders of the apocalypse riding out, so you have like the 4 creatures surrounding the throne of God, and how John even gets to that point involves his spirit leaving his body. You got to really understand what's going on, right, with this text. So his spirit leaves his body, and there he is, and he's at this place, wherever God is, he sets up a throne. So and he's on this specific plane that overrides the temporal plane. God is, and there he is. It seems almost like he would be in cosmic terms at the center of the galaxy. And it would almost seem, and everybody would have understood this, and I'm not trying to be blasphemous when I say that the 4 creatures surrounding the throne are the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac, right? And I'm not trying to make an appeal to some pagan or occultic celebration of astrology. I am very well aware of what the Bible says about those things. I'm also aware that the Bible says that stars were created for signs and times. It's almost like a clock and a calendar. So everybody would have understood that the creature that looked like a lion is the constellation of Leo. And everybody would have understood that the one that looks like a man is the constellation of Aquarius. And the one that looks like a bull is the constellation of Taurus. And the one that looks like an eagle, back in antiquity, Aquila, the eagle one, was actually later on go on to morph into Scorpio, right? So that's the fixed signs, I think, of the zodiac. I'd have to double check the actual fixed signs, but it's not. I'm not making an appeal here to some esoteric element in John's text, celebrating the virtues of astrology. Far from it. Actually, I would be making the exact opposite appeal, because John is actually John, being a Christianized Jew who experienced Jesus Christ, would definitely be wanting to interpret his own symbolic language in a very specific way. And that's why we can arrive at some sort of a coherent meaning if we're coherent about that. But that involves us going back and looking at how his cultural reference point in antiquity, as a Jew, but also as a person discoursing with Gentiles, with pagans, who, even if they are newly converted, everybody would have read those symbols and understood them in a very specific way. Your task, humbly, is to try to reverse engineer and get into that author's head and say, how did they understand their own text? Not, how do I understand their text like 2,000 years later, where our reference point is completely different. I mean, I live in an age where I have the internet, and I live in an atomized kind of universe, right? And I don't, in Western culture, there's a very materialist bend to the understanding of reality, which is always matter acting on matter, and it's actually really kind of infected the Christian understanding of itself, but in a blindsided way, where Christians don't really acknowledge that this is a huge problem, even if it is. So like, they pay lip service to the spiritual realities informing the Bible, but in practice they actually stay away from them. And if any talk of those things in any kind of pragmatic, practical terms, beyond the most rudimentary Sunday school kind of structure, is not just frowned upon, but really like anathema to modern interaction with the Bible. So, symbols by definition convey multiple levels of meaning at the same time. They are multivocal. They speak in more than one voice. So in the book of Revelation, there are, in fact, many voices. Jesus is a very central voice in the book of Revelation. In fact, much of what's being said and shown overwhelmingly is sourced by Jesus. In fact, it's a revelation by Jesus, of Jesus, the plenitive genitive in the Greek, right? Revelation of Jesus Christ, of Jesus, by Jesus, right? There are angels who speak in Revelation. There are old elders in the heavenly realm. There are living creatures around the throne of God. There are angels offering up liturgy. There is, antagonistic characters, the prophetic, aspect that announces the beast that speaks. The beast speaks. Many voices in the book of Revelation, multiple voices. Then after that, I would actually say polysemic, multiple layers of meaning. So a really good example of that would be John to the 7 churches in Asia. Okay, so here again, if I'm going to take that statement literally at face value, I'm like, John is writing to those specific 7 churches. And indeed he is. Those churches really did exist. And he is using them as a template to write to all the churches at all times throughout the entire history of the world, from the moment the churches were born to the end of time. How do I know that? Because 7 is a symbolic number that conveys the notion of completion, of a full, complete set. 7 days to a week, right? 7 churches, meaning you would understand that as all churches at all times until the end of time. So when John's writing to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Laodicea, Smyrna, and Sardis, I think that, and Philadelphia, lest we forget, you would have to understand that the qualities of those churches would then echo throughout space and time, and find, that's why whenever we run into this problem in the Gospels as well. How often have you heard a pastor, when they start getting into trouble on some sort of interpretive issue, will say, well, be careful, whoever, they'll say, be careful, because John or Jesus is speaking to the disciples, and it's important that you remember that the context is he's speaking to the disciples at that specific time, and that doesn't necessarily apply to us. And you're like, well, let me ask you this. Are you or are you not a disciple of Jesus Christ? And then this conversation might shift into, well, in the apostolic sense of the word, are you asking me if I was one of the original apostles? Because I'm like, no, I'm not asking you that. It's clear. I'm not stupid. I understand that you're not one of the original apostles. But if he's writing to his disciples or speaking to his disciples, and it only applies to them at that specific moment in time, then the gospel has absolutely nothing to offer us, because those men have lived and died and are long gone. And if the text only applies to them, then we can happily go about our merry business, because none of this applies to us. But of course, we understand in different ways. Similarly, that same pastor might turn around and say to you in a totally different context, when their back may not be against the wall on some specific issue, and say, well, if Jesus is speaking to the disciples, then, we can learn from that, because we too are disciples. So what I'm inviting you to do is just to be consistent about that, because there's a big problem with consistency in terms of biblical exegesis. When it's convenient, we say he's only speaking to the disciples at that specific moment in time. And when it's convenient, we also say that applies to us. But you actually have to hear again, that's making 2 appeals to 2 different people at 2 different spaces in time, and both are equally valid, right? You have to sustain that he's speaking to them, but he's also speaking to you. The Bible speaks to them, but it also speaks to us. The words of Jesus Christ apply to Matthew, Mark, Luke, I would say Matthew and Andrew and Bartholomew, but they also apply to you and me, right? So in the same way that if we go into the prophetic corpus of the Old Testament, when God pronounces judgment on Israel or Judah, you would say, well, there it is. There's the historical context, and yes, indeed, the ancient Israelites went off into exile, and there you go. Prophecy fulfilled, end of story. But no, the prophetic corpus is being very economical. It's making more than one appeal. it's appealing to the ancient Israelites, but then Paul is going to actually remind us that appeal to the ancient Israelites and their experience and their arc of apostasy exists as an example to you or to the church in antiquity. And then, of course, you can read Paul and say, well, is he, there you go. Is this like an example to the church in antiquity only or also to you? And this is how you maintain a living relationship with the word. If you let it die at any moment in history and stop applying it to you, then it doesn't apply to you. And then I guess you have nothing to worry about. And at this point, what are we even talking about? Right? So, when John is writing to the 7 churches in ancient antiquity, he is writing to all churches at all time. Right? Right. Okay. And similarly, let's just look at this Greek term, and to the angel of the church of Ephesus say. Well, right? Here again, multiple appeals. Yeah, I think he's referring to like an heavenly angel, but he's also appealing to a human messenger, right? To the human messenger, right? The human component. So he would be appealing to the angel of the church of Ephesus say. Do you think he's just talking about an angel in heaven that, is in charge of that church? Or is he probably more specifically speaking to the spirit informing the human agent, right, in that church? Because messenger means messenger. Angelos in the Greek is a throwback to the Hebrew malak, messenger, right? So, and then of course the provocative kind of rhetorical statement made by Jesus in the proclamations to the churches is, who and what is the spirit behind your church? So there again, you have this. If we dig, we start seeing that these appeals are stacked, layered, and I have not even begun to scratch anything in terms of what this text is saying. So I'm just wanting you to understand. So 7, a cycle of completion, right? 10 is a number in the ancient Hebrew mind that speaks of God's divine law in temporal terms, justice, right? So 3 speaks of a completion, a perfection that is related to 1. 2 is a number of opposition and contention. So you really need to understand the vast sort of constellation of symbolic meaning to all of these motifs. Lamb, lion, palm branch, horse, scales, bow, sword. All of these things are loaded terms, and we need to understand why those particular motifs are being used at that particular time and to what particular end. And if we do this in a really systematic way, we end up with a much more precise text than we originally thought we had, right? Similarly, when it comes down to trying to talk about notions of who is the Antichrist, the text sort of, definitely at one point, the son of perdition will be revealed in due time. So we can rest assured at one point that the identity of the Antichrist will be known. Great. What's far more important until that time is what Antichrist is and what is the beast in its symbolic value. Because to understand what a thing is to be able to recognize it when it's staring at you in the face. And the problem today is maybe we don't really have a full understanding of what the beast system is. So, what is the beast system is a very important question in Revelation, because to be branded by that beast system is to actually take you into a particular mode of existence where there is no point, it's a point of no return. Something has happened to you on an ontological level. Something in you is so fundamentally transformed that you are no longer created in God's image. You are no longer a God imager. You are something else, and you are something that is so not that there's no coming back from that. And in fact, I find it really interesting that in the book of Revelation, the big distinction between the damned and the saved is not whether or not they are part of a church, but whether or not they have been branded by the beast system. That is the great divide in the universe set loose in John's Apocalypse. This childish notion that this book is not actually addressing the church in the end times is, to me, laughable. The explanation is that because John ascends to heaven in Revelation 4, come up here and I will show you what must happen after this. The same voice that came to me when I was in a trance on the Lord's Day, John says, came and says, come up, and a door appeared in heaven, and I walked through. And so John basically leaves his material flesh on Patmos, and his spirit goes through this interdimensional portal. That's the text. That's what it says. And he finds himself in the heavenly realm. This is the same John that iterates to you in the Gospel of John that no flesh can stand before God and live. So this is entirely coherent. John's flesh does not depart Patmos, planet Earth. John's spirit is allowed to leave his body because his body would never be able to live. Paul had a similar experience that he articulates in 2 Corinthians 12, and he's genuinely unsure, but we'll bracket that for the relevant time. So John goes through the portal and then experiences everything else. But remember that John said that everything that follows the 7 letters to the churches, John to the 7 churches in Asia, which we already discussed, is all churches at all times. So this book is actually addressing everybody that purports to be a believer at all points in time. Because let's remember, in the last 2,000 years, every single human being on an individual basis still has to face their own great apocalypse, great tribulation, because everybody has to die in some shape or form. So this life, in some way, is a great tribulation. And at one point, you have to die. But at the same time, the text is also clearly referring to a specific moment in time, the Great Tribulation. So it's making 2 appeals at the same time. If you happen to not be alive at the Great Tribulation, don't worry, the text still has plenty to tell you, because everybody goes through life, and life is a great tribulation. And at one point, you have to give up your life, and then, boom, eternity. So the text is still entirely relevant to every single believer that's encountering this text all throughout history. But it finds the fullness of its meaning at the end of time, during the Great Tribulation, the singular one, the one that all the birth pangs of history are leading up to. And that's an interesting thing, because that's a really important biblical symbolic motif, the birth pangs. The birth pangs is a motif that goes all the way back to the Old Testament. And it's the hermeneutic key to allow us to understand the patterns of history. And so once we are able to understand the patterns of history, we're able to actually understand the consummation of history. Once we know how to recognize the patterns, then we're in a much better position to be able to say, well, how is that pattern? How are those contractions getting tighter and more amplified over time? And to what degree can we place ourselves on that timeline? And that allows us to understand the spirit of our own times, because certain things have been happening since Nimrod in Genesis. Right? It allows us to understand the whole idea of how empire, right? Global empires are a very old idea articulated in the Bible, and we understand the spirit behind that is absolutely Luciferian, and it finds its fullness at the end of time, and that is, of course, the global beast system overriding and overruled by this Antichrist figure. This is, eschatology 101, right? But you need to be able to understand the patterns of history. You need to understand what are the points of commonality between, Caesar and Napoleon and Hitler and Stalin and, the British Empire. What are the points of commonality that they have? What are some of the characteristics that we start to recognize? What is the spirit behind that moving throughout history? And how does technological advancement and the human genome tie into that? I mean, we didn't even have the hermeneutic keys to ask those questions in 1980, which is why the boomers have a really hard time with the book of Revelation. Because, oh man, the boomers. So, that should basically give us a sort of some basic challenges to think about as we go into the book of Revelation. So, again, multiple layers of meaning at the same time, and that applies as much to a parable in the Gospels, right? That's why I would say, and I would argue that a tremendous amount of the parables that Jesus utters in the Gospels are ultimately, the fullness of their meaning is definitely eschatological, definitely end times. That's where they find the fullness. That doesn't mean that there are not other applications. There are. And some of them are really pastoral, like kind of, this applies to you as a Christian dealing with your life, and it applies to your own private end times, because everybody has to live through this life, be responsible for their actions, and answer for themselves in the judgment. It is accountable to every man to live and die once, and then the judgment. So, on the one hand, you would be able to say, hey, look, this parable really applies to you, like you became overcome by the cares of this world. But at the same time, there is a larger element to that, or the wheat and the parable of the wheat and the weeds, the wheat and the tares. It's an end times parable. It's actually explained to you explicitly in the Gospels that it's an end times parable, right? The virgins with their oil, it's an end times parable. So there are multiple layers of meaning to these things. You can apply them to a specific issue in your congregation or your private Christian life, as the case may be. But the fullness of the meaning is in the consummation of time and the return of Jesus Christ. Because the fullness of the meaning of all Scripture is in the person of Jesus Christ, first and second coming. So, all right. So that's my first, that I would say that would be my introductory statements to get us into book of Revelation. So the next video I'm going to do, rather than actually get into the letters to the churches, I'm actually going to take us straight to Revelation 6, and that will be my next video. I'm going to stop this recording, and I'm going to do that recording. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to put everything that I've said here into some sort of a functional, I'm going to bring it to the fullness of what I've been talking about. I'm going to illustrate exactly what I've been saying, right? And hopefully this will help. So what I'm going to do, so what this does, what you do with this now is you're saying, okay, so you take any given verse and you're going to say, well, I'm going to bear in mind that there's a lot going on at the same time, at any given time in this text. Everything has a value that points beyond itself, right? So, if I read, well, let me just give you an example. If I read, where's my translation of Revelation 6. And I looked as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and I heard the first of the 4 living creatures proclaim like a crash of thunder, "Come." Well, right off the bat, and I'm not going to do this right now, but right off the bat, I would be like, okay, I'm interested in the Lamb. What is the symbolic value of the Lamb? Of course, I understand the Lamb is Jesus, but it would be worth reacquainting myself with why that particular animal is actually related to Jesus. Jesus is also a lion, right? So the lamb aspect of Jesus is really speaking about the value of his sacrifice for your salvation, right? He is a sacrificial lamb. This brings us into Passover. This brings us into, God's judgment passing over you. This also allows you to enter into reconciliation and harmony with God. So that whole motif really brings you into, so who is opening the 7 seals? Who is in charge of all of history? The Lamb, Jesus. Jesus is Lord of all. What's an entirely coherent statement, right, in the biblical terms. What about these 7 seals? Well, as it turns out, you would say, well, this is why I would ultimately argue for a non-strict chronology. There is a chronology in Revelations, but it's not like beginning, middle, end. Because Revelation 6 is a summary of everything else that we're going to read in terms of the destruction of the world. And I know that because if I go and I look at the symbolic value of the seals, it's actually the breaking of a will at a funeral, right? It's the death of the world and it's the opening of the will as we contend with the destruction of the world. So it's a sum, and each the Romans used to write a summary of the will on the outside of the document, and as you broke the seals, you were able to read the summary of the will, and then you got into the specifics inside the document. So it's worth kind of looking into that and understanding that. And then after that, you would say, well, 4 living creatures. 4 living creatures speaks of the number 4 is a cardinal. The 4 cardinal points of the earth, it speaks of the earth in its current state. Right? And so the 4 living creatures are, this whole cosmic clock, these constellations revolving around the center of the galaxy where God sets up his throne, like they are. What we're reading here is the 4 fixed signs around that cosmic clock are telling you that the time has come now, right? And calls forth the kingdom of the Antichrist and all its facets and everything leading up to that, so that ultimately this will make way for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So it's a summary. So I'm well ahead of myself. I don't actually plan on unpacking this in this particular video. Let's wrap it up, and after that we'll just get right into this particular thing, and then after that I might backtrack and go back to the letters to the 7 churches at that specific moment in time, but also every church at any moment in time, right? And every individual in any given one of the churches. And you'll find yourself asking the question, I would hope, what church do I belong to at any given moment in my Christian walk with Christ? Am I part of this church? And is it possible for me to migrate from this church to this church? Because what I really want to do is be in that blameless church, Philadelphia. And I'm not even going to touch right now this whole business of whether or not Philadelphia signals, a rapture. I don't believe it does, but whatever melts your butter for the time being. I can make a plausible argument that that's not really what this is about. But I am really interested in the fact that there is no blame ascribed to the Philadelphian church. It's a church that is relatively blameless. There is no admonition there. That's the church I would like to belong to, God willing. So that's the journey I'm on. That's where I want to be. It doesn't matter. I don't see that as I want to be there because I want to be raptured. No, I want to be there because God is well pleased with that church. And that's why I want to be there. And the question is, am I there? And you have to examine your conscience and ask yourself that question. Anyways, so hopefully this was helpful.